salesman for Queensland, the principal one, the main one, the one that has to accept the responsibility if the sale is not a good one and if we're not getting good results.
Champion of private enterprise, champion of states' rights, scourge of socialists, troublemakers, drug pushers and vagrants, Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen was Queensland's longest-serving Premier. Over a 19-year period, he presided over fundamental and far-reaching development in the northern state. He also presided over a system of fundamental and far-reaching corruption in the state's police force and within the government itself. Love him or hate him, for a quarter of a century, it's been impossible to ignore Joh Bjelke-Petersen. For years in Queensland, they loved him. If the truth be known, they probably still do. For better or worse, he put Queensland on the map. For a while there, I was one of his chooks, a member of the media that Joh fed every day with an unending stream of propaganda, invective and browbeating. To meet up with him again, I travelled to Tasmania, of all places, where he now spends much of his time. Over several hours of discussion and interview, he was relaxed, lucid, and I'd have to say, sharp as a tack. Before I share that exchange with you, let's have a look at the genesis of this fearsome spectre from the deep north.
On the 13th of January 1911, an event occurred in New Zealand which was to have a profound effect on the future of Australia. In that country of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, Joh Bjelke-Petersen was born, and I bet he came out fighting.
Joh's parents, Carl and Maren, migrated to Australia from Denmark. Carl was a minister in the Lutheran Church. The couple married in New Zealand but returned to Australia with their young family when Carl became too ill to work. The Bjelke-Petersen family purchased Bethany in the South Burnett region of Queensland. It was land covered in dense vine jungle scrub. Joh and his older brother Christian were too young to work and their father too weak, so their mother supervised and took part in much of the work. Her strength and effort were an inspiration to young Joh. When he was 9, however, Joh developed a severe pain in one leg. The doctor said there was nothing that could be done. He was suffering from infantile paralysis, polio.
That's why I limp a little bit. This leg's a little shorter, but I was one of the fortunate ones because I was able to walk ultimately again. But for 12 months I couldn't walk. I used to hop around.
Do you think that had an effect upon you?
Well, it slowed me down. I think before that I was a very self-possessed little fella, so it did slow me down. And I think it was probably for the better because I think I would have grown up a very, very, well, perhaps different. I suppose you'd say, George, that I'm bad enough as it is.
At 13, Joh left school to work on the family property. He continued his education, coached by his younger sister, Nita. Your brother died quite young, didn't he?
Christian, he was 3 years older than myself, yes. He was with only 3 of us. Still my sister left. She lives out west in a western property.
Your brother was quite a different sort of character too.
Christian was quite different. He was a studious fellow in every sense of the word. He didn't like to do any manual work, and he studied right till the end, till he was 22, like father.
How did he die?
Well, Christian, I think because he didn't get enough exercise or whatever you like to term it, he had ulcers.
Right.
And those days they didn't know what ulcers were, and he couldn't then eat the foods, certain foods, and
you
then
think his studious lifestyle might have contributed to?
Well, we think so. When you sit at a desk all day, and like he had done most of his life, and he didn't like doing anything on the property, and most of the time he was away at school in Brisbane.
You've never seemed to have had much respect or time for academic types.
Well, first of all, that's not quite true. I often say that they float in space. I have my 2 feet on the ground. And I always say there's no substitute for experience. And I also say that I'm still at school. My whole life has been one schooling.
Joh became a lay preacher in the Lutheran Church and taught Sunday school right up until his early days as Queensland Premier. When Joh was 15, the family bought a nearby property which Joh managed. For 15 years, so the story goes, Joh lived in a cowshed, spending 6 days a week clearing, ploughing and planting. On Sundays, he would go home to Bethany, wash and go to church.
Why peanuts, by the way? Why peanuts? Why did you go into growing peanuts?
Well, in those days we were growing large quantities of maize, beautiful crops of maize, and of course you couldn't sell it. There were no cornflakes, nothing of that sort. The only people we could sell it to was the people in Brisbane who had carrying horses for the carrying business, and then for the sheep people out west of there was a drought on. Otherwise we had piles of mountains of maize that you couldn't sell. So we looked around for different things. There were a number of people, I wasn't the first, but I was up near the first, but quite a number of people had been growing peanuts and shaking the peanuts off by hand. And then I started to grow peanuts myself at home in Bethany, and there was good money in those. You could sell those because people would eat peanuts, they couldn't eat maize.
Yes,
so we got switched over, and then I built my own peanut thresher with the help of another man. I went contracting for all the other farmers for about 5 months of the year.
How have you lived with all the name calling that's gone on about peanuts ever since? I mean,
Well, I don't mind it in the slightest. They used to call me the Courier Mail, particularly the Flying Peanut.
That's right.
I was the only member of Parliament who flew his own aeroplane, but that shows you how far thinking I was in those days.
In 1933, Joh borrowed £100 as a deposit on a tractor. It was the beginning of his wealth. He could plough and sow more quickly and employed others to clear the land. He hired himself and his tractor out to work for others. His profits escalated.
is it true that you developed a system whereby you had a generator on the tractor and you could do clearing at night time?
I was the first to get a tractor in my area, and they had no self-starters on them, or they had no lights. I very promptly soon bought a generator in Brisbane, 160 miles from home, and put it on the side of the tractor, fitted it in, and put a belt on the pulley, and I ran my own lights. The only one in all my life on those contracting days that ever had lights, but he had his own lights. They had a knock off when it was dark. I could go till all hours of the night and right through the night.
How much significance do you think there is in the fact that you did it on your own and you've done things your way all the time in political life, business life, etc.?
Necessity forces you to make decisions and do things. And you realise you have to do these things to get ahead. And my one big burning desire was to get out of the abject poverty in which we lived. See, everybody had about 160 acres of land, and they cleared the scrub and they milked cows. That's what everybody in those days had to do to make a living, or sort of a living, half a living.
In 1946, Joh was elected to the Kingaroy Shire Council, and next year won the state seat of Nanango for the Country Party. He was 36.
They came to me then, people, and said, Joh, everybody knows you've got a good record. We want you to stand for Parliament. And I nearly fell over when they suggested it. I said, George, at the start, I said, no, I wouldn't accept that. Look, who could run all my dozers and aeroplanes and things? And then they kept at me. They wanted me. Sir Charles Adderman was one, and others. And
these old country party leaders.
Yes, that's correct. Then I thought I could do both. So I said, all right, I'll stand for Parliament. I had a lot of experience before that. I had 10 years as the secretary for the federal and state member of the district. I just did that voluntarily to help them because I admired them and respected them. So I knew a fair bit about politics. I did their broadcasting, made up the speeches to do the broadcasting for them in those days, far-off days, 50 years ago. And they left it to me. They never said, what you're going to say, Joh. They knew I'd say the right thing then in those days, George.
In January 1952, Joh Bjelke-Petersen announced his engagement to Florence Gilmore of New Farm, Brisbane. She was secretary to the State Commissioner for Roads.
Flo told me later on that those young engineers said to her, whoever he asks you to go out, you go, because he's not married and he's got lots of money. That's what people seemed to think of me in those days, because we had those and aeroplanes.
He was right.
So I said to Flo one day, have you ever been to Parliament House? She said, no, I've never been up there. I said, what about coming up? And she said, I'd like to come up.
Your first date with the Parliament House.
And I can remember that I said, well, come up and I'll have dinner. We're going to take a dinner before we listen in. We're sitting tonight. And so I took her into the visitors' room of Parliament House. And I can remember the various members of Parliament as they walked past their visitors' room where we have guests. There won't be all half a dozen or dozen people, members in there with their wives and friends and so on. But when they saw me sitting with this lady, young girl, I can remember Jim Sparks, Sir James Sparks, Bob Sparks' father. He walked past and he stopped and he came back and he went at me like this. Much as to say, what do I see?
Flo and Joh were married at the Fortitude Valley Presbyterian Church on May the 31st, 1952.
The real trouble today in the political arena, people think in terms of how many votes will I get if I do this or if I don't do it, and they waffle around.
You're not trying to tell me that you don't think how many votes.
Well, I always believed that I'd get more votes, George, if I did the right thing. I had a little formula that I used on every issue. I was told by perhaps my staff this or that, and I applied, is it right or is it wrong, is it good or bad? And on that basis, I went down that road using that formula, a very simple formula.
But you'd have to add a right of that, wouldn't you? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it good or is it bad?
Yeah.
According to the gospel, according to Joh.
That is true. To me, that is based on scripture, on the truth of the Bible, as we believe it, what is true and it doesn't change.
Is your political ideology as well as your personal philosophy and your morality, all based upon the scriptures?
Sure, absolutely. And that doesn't change.
Since 1915, Labor had been in power in Queensland for all but 3 years. It seemed they could never be defeated, but after an agonising split, they actually self-destructed. In 1957, Frank Nicklin became the Country Party Premier in a coalition government. 6 years later, Nicklin chose the still little-known Bjelke-Petersen to be his Minister for Works and Housing. It was a great portfolio for a man who knew the value of a favour.
The Works and Housing is the area where members, all members, Labor, everyone's got to come to the minister if they want things done. Schools built, repairs, 1,001 things. We operated just as I did in my business, on the telephone, lived on the telephone, and I was the first one, the minister...
So you conducted politics as though it was a business?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think ultimately that was a very, very important thing that you did? Absolutely. It became crucial to your political future?
This is the point, George, yes, that if I hadn't have got that portfolio, I may never have been Premier.
After 10 years, Nicklin retired as Premier. His successor, Jack Pizzey, died after only 6 months in office. And Bjelke-Petersen, Pizzey's deputy, became Premier. It was not an easy transition. For the first time, Joh was attacked over his private interests in companies doing business in Queensland. He didn't seem to defend himself too well.
My personal interest in oil exploration in Queensland dates back right to 1954. If oil had not been discovered in Queensland, it is unlikely that the leader of the opposition would have troubled to make the present accusation. The amount that I received from the initial transaction did little more than compensate me for my time and my efforts over the years.
The coalition won the 1969 state election, but there were still worries about his media performance. On television, Joh appeared impatient, unrepentant, and a little ill-tempered.
You're going to tell the Country Party to mind its own business too on this one?
If they attempt to tell me to sell my shares or to rearrange them as you're trying to do, I certainly will, because I have indicated to you exactly what the position is. You know it and everybody else knows it. I've certainly been very fair to you and to the press. You're only trying to misconstrue it and say you can, I'm not going to discuss with you when you try and create a situation such as this.
I'm not trying to create any situation, Mr. Premier. I'm asking you whether you maintain your attitude that what you did was right and proper, and whether you will continue to hold shares in public companies.
I haven't done anything in this particular issue at all, as you jolly well know.
But you have held shares in companies which have dealings with the public.
If you're going to try and misconstrue it just for your own political propaganda, you've got another thing coming.
Mr. Premier, thank you very much.
The Country Party knives were out.
These 4 men were waiting in the lobby at Parliament House, and they said to me, Mr. Premier, we want to see you. I said, what do you want to see me for? I'm just going to go to this dinner. I've only got 10 minutes to get there. It starts at 6 o'clock. And they said, well, we want to talk to you about the leadership. Oh, gee, that sort of rang a few bells. And I thought, I wonder what this is. So I said, well, you better come inside. And then they said, well, you know, Mr. Premier, that the Spark says that you're not performing well and that you've got to pull your socks up. And I said, do you guys mean to tell me you want me to take my hat off the peg there. I wore a hat in those days. And,
I remember that hat.
And they said to me, yes, that's exactly what we do. But I said, what do I tell people and so on that I've resigned? You want me to go home? Well, I won't be there. And I said, well, I'm not going to. It's as simple as that, because I said, you're to blame as much as I am if there's bad publicity. And of course, that night I had to sit at this dinner till 11:30. And I can tell you I didn't enjoy that dinner very much at all. At 12 o'clock I got home to the motel up in the top up here where Flo was staying. And I woke her up and we had a cup of coffee and we talked about it. And I said that we got a problem on our hands in the morning. And Flo, and I said, it doesn't look too good. They reckon they've got the numbers, they're going to knock me off. We went to bed and had a few hours sleep, and I was up again between 4 and 5 o'clock. And it was in the days when you had to ring the switch girl down the stairs to get your numbers through. And I wanted to ring all my members to find out what all this was about. And I couldn't get through this switch girl. She used to keep me waiting for 10 minutes and more for each call. And so in the end I said to her, look, if you don't smarten up, I'll have to leave this motel and go to somewhere where I can get a service. So from then on I put them one through after the other, but I couldn't find many of them. They were all scattered and I couldn't get onto them. So at 7 o'clock I said to Flo, I'm going back up to Parliament House. And I ran into Henry McGeckney on the way and I said, Henry, I've got a job for you to do today. And I said, I don't want to start behind scratch. I want you to say, move a motion of confidence in me. When the day came and the time came, I finished with any other business, and I gave Henry just a little nod, and he jumped up and he just said, oh, Mr. Premier, there's a whole lot of disquiet about you and your performance as Premier. I don't know, whether there's any much in it, but I think we ought to, anyway, I'm going to just move a vote of say that we think you're all right and so on, and very feeble. It was always worse than nothing.
He was damning you with faint praise.
Yeah, it wasn't what I hoped. And then the thing started, and they criticised and condemned me and for all sorts of things, and the fair uproar. But it ended up in, when we had the vote, there was two my way, my own and one extra one. There, Russ called out, well, if you don't, we'll get you upstairs, Mr. Premier. If we didn't get you here, we'll get you upstairs. So I thought, oh, gee, that's something I got to think about.
I guess you could say, who needs the opposition when you've got your mates?
Yeah, I knew there'd be a motion of no confidence because it was all over the house. As I was running up the stairs to the next floor where the house was sitting, I suddenly thought of a scheme. I quickly got on the phone. I rang Beryl Young at the airport, where she was at the time. And I said to Beryl, you get in a plane, the fastest one you can get, and duck up and get Sparks down. He's created this noise. You better come down and talk to these fellas before they all go berserk. Like a lot of wild cattle here. They're running in all directions. But anyway, before I could realise it, I heard that Sparks had arrived. Beryl must have got up there pretty smart up and got him back. And anyway, he talked to someone. I don't know what he said. I never ever found out, but he probably told them, from what I gathered, that you've had one chop at Joe, you're not going to have another one in there and then wreck the government. So they made it realise, so won.
A few months later, Joe hired Alan Callaghan as his press secretary to beef up his public image.
Alan was a very knowledgeable, very able man. He was an ABC interviewer, and he was the one that came and interviewed me at different times, and I remember he was always the lead of the pack. But the interesting thing I also said about Alan, I was there before he came. He tried to pull me down for years as an ABC reporter. He worked terribly hard. He wanted me to retire when he retired. And I said, no, Alan. He said, you're at your peak. That was many, many years before I retired. I said, no, Alan, I'll manage. Don't you worry about that.
I wondered how long it was going to take us.
So I said to... but I missed Alan. He's great company, great guy.
There was a period when people suggested that you'd become almost a creation of Alan Callaghan. That suddenly all sorts of marvellous media tricks began to work for you.
Well, there were a few things. And Alan was clever at coming up with a little sort of few words that might fit the occasion. The Aborigines were outside with a big jar of blood they got from a butcher shop. And they wanted to present it to me, Alan said, to say that this is what I had bled the Aboriginals to death, sort of thing. So Alan said to me, all the media out there, you'll have to go out and see them. I can't leave them there. I said, OK, Alan, I'll go out and see them. And just as I was going through the door to go out to them, Alan said, Premier, just tell them you'd have been much more impressed if they'd have bought a bottle of sweat than a bottle of blood. So I said that to the media. And of course it diffused the whole thing.
In 1971, the South African rugby team, the Springboks, toured Australia to widespread protest and disruption in the southern states. Callaghan's idea was to show that Joh would have none of that in Queensland. In what might be considered an overreaction for a game of football, the Queensland government declared a state of emergency. The unions protested in a frenzy of strike action. Consequently, the Conservatives won 2 by-elections held on the weekend of the rugby match. The politically ruthless Callaghan had given his Premier a vote-winning image as the tough controller of Queensland's destiny. So much for poor Billy McMahon at the helm of the federal coalition. When Gough Whitlam came to power in Canberra, Joh leapt onto the national stage.
The time that you probably became a more national media figure was the time that you locked horns with Gough Whitlam in 73. That was a monumental political punch-up between you. Tell me about why was there such venom between you and Whitlam?
Gough used to say to me, Joh, why can't you leave me alone? I don't torment you and criticise you all the time. I said, Gough, it's not you personally, it's your jolly politics that I can't stomach.
Joh outmanoeuvred Gough twice over vacancies in the federal Senate. The first time in 1974 when DLP Senator and former Queensland Premier Vince Gare accepted the job of ambassador to Ireland. And then again in 1975 when Joh selected Albert Patrick Field over Labor's nomination to fill the vacancy created when Bert Milliner died. Field, vilified for life as a Labor turncoat, sat for only 1 week, but his appointment deprived Whitlam of a vote in the Senate and allowed Malcolm Fraser to block supply. Joh, that Bible-bashing bastard as Whitlam called him, had outfoxed the Labor Prime Minister again.
Did you really think that they were socialists?
They are, so I didn't think it, I knew it.
Really? You still think that? I mean, it's a pretty strange definition of a socialist, the Labor Party.
No, look, because I've lived in politics for 41 years in Parliament, 10 years before that, you know, I have a very great depth insight. The slightest move off this way or that way, you can read what it means.
Instinctive for you. Is Keating a socialist?
Keating, well, if he's not a socialist, I don't know what he is. He's nothing else to me. He promotes...
He would deny it emphatically.
Oh, he denied it. In fact, why does he have those socialistic policies? High taxation. I used to say the only thing he doesn't tax, George, is your false teeth. Have you got any? I haven't got any. Neither have you. But then I had to stop saying that because the false teeth manufacturer rang me up and said, Mr. Premier, you've got to stop saying that because he taxes the material we make false teeth out of.
But winning against the socialists in Canberra didn't mean that life was all beer and skittles for Joh. Confronted time and again on the question of his shares and the possibility of a conflict of interest, Bjelke-Petersen had 2 answers. The first always along these lines.
You shouldn't say a thing like that. I have no coal interests. All my family have no coal interests. I don't know what makes you say you ought to withdraw that. I wouldn't threaten you with a writ, but you shouldn't say it because it's not true.
These official documents from the Brisbane Stock Exchange and the Company's Office show that a company called Oilmin has tendered to the Queensland Government to supply coal to a State Electricity Commission powerhouse to be commissioned in the mid-1980s. The list of shareholders of Oilmin shows that Johannes Bjelke-Petersen holds 21,000 shares.
If that failed, there was the old standby.
Yes. Would you like to have a premier or a minister or government that never owned anything, never did anything, never achieved anything? Is that the sort of person you'd like to have?
It was unconventional, but he seemed to get away with it. With a shrinking Queensland rural population, the Country Party was in danger of becoming marginalised. In 1974, it changed its name. The new National Party, while keeping its rural power base, hoped to attract Conservative votes in the city electorates. The ultimate objective was to break with the Liberals and rule alone, both in Queensland and nationally.
People united will never be defeated. The
Selling the virtues of National Party-style good government was difficult when the riffraff were out on the streets protesting. So in 1976, the government introduced new laws banning street marches. At the same time, throughout the state, rampant development went on almost completely unchallenged.
Quite often the criticism is made that it was development for its own sake, that you were development mad, development at the expense of everything and anything else.
No, no. What happens when you create the right climate, make it easier for people to live, give them security, and you know the people know they've got a government that is strong and positive and so on against unions and the vandalism, then they do things, they achieve things, and that's all we did in Queensland. We made it easier for them to live, we gave them security. Private enterprise did all that, and it was terrific.
Right across the road from Parliament House was one of Brisbane's grand old buildings, the Bellevue Hotel. While a future for the Bellevue was being publicly negotiated, Joh's cabinet had already made up its mind.
Save the Bellevue! Save the Bellevue!
I think the question that every voter in this state wants to ask themselves is, what kind of a government would behave like a thief in the night when, with contracts that have obviously been let weeks before this event, all this charade and facade about consulting the joint parties, consulting public opinion, is just a nonsense. The government has made a mockery of its own people, of the public, of the voting public, as they've made a mockery of their own senior civil servants in recent weeks and months, as they continue to make a mockery over so many issues. It's just disgusting.
A lot of people believed,
yes,
including people like the Dean of Brisbane on one occasion, that famous Bellevue incident, that you rode roughshod over democracy.
No. Now, the Dean, he was lost in that as he was in many other, on that Bellevue thing. It was a document signed by all the Liberal ministers. Every one of them signed it. It wasn't me. It wasn't brought by me to cabinet.
Thief in the night act.
They blamed me, and I got the blame by the Dean and everybody else, and I said to him...
But why did they have to do it in the middle of the night like that? It looked like you were trying to get away with something.
It wasn't me. It had nothing to do with it. It was by the minister of that department. It was signed...
You knew about it?
Well, I signed the document like all the other Liberal ministers did who kicked up the shindig.
The Liberals were angry with Bjelke-Petersen, but not angry enough to leave the coalition. What they did do was run a separate ticket for the Senate in 1980. So the Nationals needed a high-profile figure to lead their ticket.
The Queen was so lovely and so gracious, and she looked so perfectly charming. And she asked the Premier to come forward and sit beside her at a table, and then I sat just a little way away, and I felt that I was part of the visit to Buckingham Palace.
Initially, people said that I would probably switch to the Senate. That was what went in the papers. But why would I want to leave being a Premier to just become a Member of Parliament now and in the Senate, a Senator?
Good question.
So, but I then knew that when we had such short notice, the only one that would really get the vote would be Flo, because she had such a tremendous support everywhere, and she ran my electorate for me at home. She became known as a member, and I was only the Premier. We both happened to go to a function together.
It was a smart move, and the impact of the Bjelke-Petersen name put paid to any rumblings about Joh's recent performance. Into the 80s, the Liberals kept losing seats in Queensland elections, and their role in government was being seriously squeezed. Funds traditionally donated to the Liberal Party and their causes drifted to where the decisions were being made. The benefit to donors was obvious.
Mr. Bjelke-Petersen came to me and said, I'm trying to raise $200,000 to build a senior citizens hospice. I said, right, how much can you raise? And he said, I feel we can raise 100,000. I said, write my name down for another 100.
Just like that?
Just like that.
Which came first, the cheque and the knighthood, or...?
The cheque and the knighthood.
Or the 100,000?
Oh, no, I paid the 100,000 before I received the knighthood.
Was the Bjelke-Petersen Foundation not exactly the smartest thing that you ever did to set it up?
Well, first of all...
The trouble it got you into?
No, the Bjelke-Petersen Foundation, no, that was quite all right. There was nothing wrong with that. I didn't bring it up. It was Sparks that brought it up. Because of the support I got at the votes, politically in every respect, because people supported me, The party, not me, got a lot of money, much more than they needed. And they decided to invest it in buildings and all sorts of things. So they did that. Legitimate, open, everybody knew it, so on. And so there was nothing sinister about that. I suppose we were the envy of the Labor Party and others who couldn't generate that sort of support and help.
Isn't it the case that regardless of its legality or otherwise, if it was perfectly legal, it was always going to be seen, potentially, as a political problem for you, because people were going to see it as political favours in return for donations to the National Party?
No.
And that's graft and corruption by any other name.
No, it didn't happen, because even Fitzgerald couldn't find it. He went 20 years, he went through all that I had did, all the thousands of contracts that had gone through. He did it with me in the court and questioned me and all sorts of things. And they went through it for over 6-7 months, the whole activity, and they never found one thing that was out of order. Not one thing. And Drummond, after a request and demand of my legal people, the prosecutor, he had to give us a letter to say they couldn't find anything that justified any action against me or the government or anybody. Now that's pretty good. You can't beat that one. And they concentrated on the National Party and on me and not on the Labor Party.
The split in the coalition occurred over a Liberal backbench move to establish a public accounts committee. This led to a spill in the Liberal leadership, Terry White taking over from the relatively mouse-like Dr. Lou Edwards. In a good old Mexican standoff, Joh refused to have the new leader in his cabinet. All the Liberal ministers submitted their resignations.
Was the silliest thing that you and the Nationals ever did was to break with the Liberals and try to go it alone in places like Brisbane? That seems to a lot of people to have been the beginning of the end of that domination that you had.
No, that again is wrong. If you'd lived where I had, very, very hard to live in harmony and coalition with a partner. It doesn't matter who he is, because
you didn't really have much time for them,
they have different policies and different attitudes. That is, our party more or less stands for private enterprise, and private enterprise to me is what gives people an incentive to do things and to achieve things and to provide labour and work and so on. In the society in which we live, I believe that was the best party. The other party, they didn't like boards and peanut marketing board or the wheat board or the barley board and all these things. They wanted, as it were, open competition. You sell your stuff where you like rather than through a board.
Because you didn't have a lot in common with the Liberals anyway, did you?
Well, on some of these issues, we worked fairly closely to them, and yet again, it was very, very hard. It was only after I became the Treasurer, as well as the Premier, when we parted with the Liberals, or when they parted from us. We didn't eliminate them, they eliminated themselves. The first time they gave me their resignations, I asked the Governor not to accept them, and that's history, of course. And the Governor, after a day of meditation and consideration, at 5 o'clock that evening, he finally said, "All right, Mr. Premier, I agree with you, I won't accept them." But then a week later...
They thought they could beat you, didn't they?
They did, yes, and they were like a group, a lot of whales. They beached themselves a second time. They came in with their resignations a week later. They'd been asked to by their organisation. And I again said to them, "You're silly, once you get out of politics," I said, "it's very lonely and very cold out there." I told all those boys, that the Liberal ministers that came to me that night with their resignations, I said, "You'll rue it." Well, they said, "We've got no option. We've been ordered to," and so I said to the Governor, "Accept them."
All this in the run-up to an election. The result was ultimately a disaster for the Liberals. Needing 42 seats for a majority, the Nationals got 41. Within a few days, Liberal ministers Brian Austin and Don Lane defected to Joh and the Nationals.
Where do you think your action leaves the Liberal Party now?
It leaves the Liberal Party 2 members less. I think it's down to 5 at the moment, getting closer and closer to be able to hold those meetings in the telephone box.
The Nationals were the government, alone at last.
You acted like a chief executive officer rather than a premier.
Had to. And that's why we got things done in Queensland. You know, you take Expo, every one of them were against me. They said, "Rand can't do it, Kane can't do it, it's too big, it's too costly. We won't, you can't do it, Mr. Premier." I said, "Of course I can." And Malcolm had rung me up to say that Rand had now finally knocked it off and wouldn't take it. He said, "Joe, this is 11 o'clock at one night." And I said, he said, "Will you do it?" And I said, "Yes, I'll do it, of course I will." And I was excited. I went to Cabinet and every one of them, "Joe," they said, "you don't think you can do that? If they can't do it," and I said, "No fear."
So how did you get them around?
Well, I just started. I didn't just ignore them. I didn't argue with them. I just went and started. I got
that's why people talk of you as a dictator.
Well, I just got Sir Sidney Schubert in and Leo Hilston, my treasurer, 2 top fellas. And we sat down and
So
talked.
did you what? Did you say you did Expo without a cabinet?
Well, I did. They didn't want it. Every one of them will tell you they were against it.
But did it ever go through a cabinet? Did it ever go through a cabinet?
Oh, yes, it would have ultimately, I guess. I can't remember the details about that. But they didn't want it. They were against it. But as I said, I didn't argue with them. I was absolutely flabbergasted. They couldn't see the benefit of it.
Making it sound a bit like a one-man show.
Yeah, it was a one-man show a lot of the time. I don't mind admitting it because things wouldn't have happened. This is why I say in the area of politics and the political arena, it's almost impossible to get a leader who will be out in front leading.
In 1984, Joh was rewarded for his efforts with a knighthood. Then a year later came what Joh would probably regard as one of his finest hours. After 2 weeks of blackouts, he sacked 1,000 striking electricity workers and re-advertised their jobs. Police protection was provided for contractors doing their work. When the dispute was over, the labour movement across the country had been given a jolt.
I'm a very tolerant man. I don't try and force my ideas on you or anybody else in relation to...
Tolerance is not a word that's immediately associated with you.
Well, I abide by what the law is required, and this is what I say in relation to the strikers. I said, the law gives you the opportunity through the Arbitration Commission to put your case, not to cause chaos in the streets or in the factories and so on. And I said, why should you... the principle of hurting as many people as you can in a strike so that you or me could get a greater reward, that to me is wrong.
Is it possible, though, that because of the kind of life that you led and because we were this self-made man,
sure,
that you don't really understand people who aren't like that?
No, George...
People who do need trade unions, for instance.
Well, we guys can say we need trade unions, but we need them to go along certain lines, like through the arbitration court. They accept that when it suits them. If it doesn't suit them, they say, we won't bother with the arbitration court decision.
Victories aside, in the lead-up to the 1986 election, everyone knew he was a goner.
So, Joh, can I put it to you that you'd really be up against it this election? I mean, you've been racked by a series of scandals, haven't you? There've been... Your former trusted advisors, the Calligans, have both ended up in court. Sir Edward Lyons, your good friend, has been forced to resign from the TAB chairmanship, from the National Party trusteeship, from Channel 9. You've had the recent furore over the $400,000 defamation settlement.
Andrew, I've got a lot of valuable time, but I haven't got as much valuable time as to sit here answering all your mouthings of all sorts of things that doesn't add up to anything.
Even more damning was Sir Roderick Proctor's interesting lesson on the difference between free enterprise and Queensland-style private enterprise.
They call it cronyism, of course.
That's right.
There's no, as far as you're concerned, there's no denying that does exist.
I don't deny it, no.
Well, how damaging then is that? I mean, the government, for example, quite often doesn't bother to tender for projects, and it could be argued that if you're going to get the best competition, then you should invite as many competitors as possible.
Yes, well, I certainly agree with that assertion, and I think it even goes further, that on a number of occasions, tenders have been called when it was fairly obvious that this was only a charade, and that it had already been decided who was going to be granted the contract.
He was chairman of a building society that was under the indirect control of the government, and when he came 70 years of age, I said, it's time you step down. He said he wanted another year, so we gave him another year.
Why did he step down at the age of 70?
Well, simply because it is a rule in all through the public service and all these areas of activity over which the government has.
But you're a premier and you're over the age of 70.
Yes, I'm 70, soon 76, in case you don't know, and I'm doing a good job.
Joh campaigned relentlessly, and a mammoth advertising blitz was launched in an attempt to save the election for the Nationals.
I've got some wonderful news for Queensland. We're going to remain strong and secure. We're going to have stable government for the next 3 years. There'll be no strikes, the power will stay on, the lights will stay on.
Joh had delivered the impossible. He probably felt invincible. He could have finished right there at the peak of his career, but he had one more task to perform.
The 76-year-old Premier had crowned himself King of the Opposition, and his populist message was simple: flat tax.
no compromise. You can't have any tax of any sort, any new tax. Less taxes, lower taxes. And it can be done. We have put it through our computers again and again by top people. People sometimes, well, they're very distinguished people. I won't give you the names because you'll only torment them, but it works, and it works handsomely.
If your supporters win today, Sir Joh, what happens next?
If we win? You say if?
You think there's no question about you winning today?
It's finished. It's all over. It's long ago.
For Joh, it was simple. Ian Sinclair and John Howard were yesterday's men. It was a stunning display of political arrogance.
Bye-bye, John.
The Joh for PM campaign was a disaster. All he succeeded in doing was ruining John Howard's chances. And for the first time, Joh had to get used to the idea of losing.
We're going to go. Bob Sparks stepped forward for the first time and said, Joh, you've got a tremendous lead now, and everything's going. I'm going to make it official. And I couldn't stop him, and he said, I'm going to go to Canberra and talk to John Howard and Sinclair and get their approval. They were the leaders. And of course he went down there, and that argument went on for about 5 weeks, and they never got him. They wouldn't agree. They said, Joh, you can be part of us and campaign for us. We'd be very grateful if he would, but he's not going to be the leader. And then they even said that they'd promised me a job in the ministry. I said, how kind of them. I said, I'm Premier up here. Who'd want to be a minister in their setup anyway?
So you did want to be Prime Minister?
Well, I said, I didn't want to be Prime Minister in that sense. I wanted to clean up the place for 3 years.
While Sir Joh was away, the Moonlight State was broadcast.
Despite some wholesome attempts to pretend otherwise, the Queensland government has not managed to stop the devil at the border. In the Sunshine State, sex is a great little earner.
For the Nationals and Joh, it was the beginning of the end.
Competition in Queensland's vice industry is actively discouraged. There is a cooperative of ownership, of management of the unlicensed nightclubs, the massage parlours, the escort agencies and the illegal casinos. There's a strong case to show that instead of prosecuting these people, the police prefer to protect them.
There were red faces all over the state, and the now famous Fitzgerald inquiry was announced.
There's been a series of police ministers that have had this hanging over their head. And it's not going to hang over my head, I can tell you. I'm going to go out and I'm going to get it done.
Absolutely disgusting, disgraceful, despicable. And I could go on and on and on. Those fellas who instigated that and did that to me, when they must have known absolutely that it was not true. It was interesting for me to sit there and cop it.
What is it just wasn't true?
Well, all these things. They found that there was nothing in it.
About you?
About me. They went right back in my own
What about the corruption? What about the long history of corruption in Queensland, including the years of your premiership?
Well, New South Wales and Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia, they leave everything for dead.
But that doesn't make it right.
No, but that doesn't make it right at all. But who would have known that the police were taking things? But we found that it had been going on since 1929, this whole exercise time. It didn't start in my period of time.
One thing that had begun in Joh's time was the meteoric rise of Charleville Police Inspector Terry Lewis. In May 1976, Lewis drove 197 kilometres to Cunnamulla to dine with Joh.
In demonstrations.
Subsequently, he inundated Sir Joh with letters praising himself and suggesting that Police Commissioner Ray Whitrod was a Labor man. This was the same Terry Lewis Whitrod had exiled from Brisbane because of the persistent stench of corruption hanging around him. Political interference in his efforts to investigate police misconduct frustrated Whitrod. In the end, he chose to resign.
If the Premier or the government don't want certain laws enforced generally, they should seek to persuade Parliament to amend them. If the Premier wishes to change the authority and responsibility of the Commissioner of Police, he should seek to amend the Police Act. Interference with the Commissioner's responsibility had reached the stage where I was no longer in command of the force. I was not prepared to be merely a front for other people's decisions in areas of my responsibility. The only way I could draw attention to this situation was by resigning.
So was the appointment of Mr. Lewis as the new commissioner, or as assistant commissioner, the straw that broke the camel's back? In other words, forced you out of the force?
What do you find objectionable about Commissioner Lewis?
I don't think he's the most suitable person for that vacancy.
Why not?
Tell us why.
No, I cannot.
Are there any doubts in your mind about his background, about the way he's gone through the police?
I don't want to answer that question.
Do you think he's a capable man, sir?
Suggestions of impropriety.
Say again?
I have heard some suggestions of impropriety by Commissioner Lewis.
I don't want to answer that question.
Terry Lewis had been brought in from the cold, or should that be hot, of Charleville. As it turned out, the shark had been put in charge of the wading pool.
What about your relationship with Terry Lewis?
Well, Terry Lewis
This has become an infamous association. Do you think it might have been a good thing had you never, ever set eyes on Terry Lewis?
No, I don't at all, because he's only in there on the word of one man, and that's Jack Herbert, who is a self-confessed liar and corrupt man. He has admitted that, and it's on his word that he got put into jail.
Herbert's word against Terry Lewis?
Yeah, that's what it seems to
take
amount
Terry
to.
Lewis. Yeah, but if you had your time over again, would you?
I'd do exactly the same as
Really?
I did then. Yes, exactly the same.
Ex-Inspector Jefferson gave evidence yesterday that he warned Sir Joh about police corruption at a meeting at Lennon's Hotel in 1978.
Do you remember Alec Jefferson, the police officer?
I know the name. I can remember the name quite well, yes.
Well, it's strongly suggested he came to you with quite substantial evidence of corruption.
Well, this is interesting. He did come, and there was one other fellow came with him, and I forget his name at the time. But look, in every area I had people. I discussed it with the police commissioner, and he said, and others, and the ministers, they said that is not the correct story. Who would you believe? Who would you believe in these things? Jefferson?
In retrospect, maybe he should have been believed.
Well, he could have been. It could have been.
You think maybe
well, in retrospect
with
now...
the wisdom of hindsight and the knowledge that we have now,
yeah,
as a result of the Fitzgerald inquiry, maybe Alec Jefferson and those police officers who were sounding the warning bells were right.
Well, they could have been right. They could have been right. There's nobody's denying that. But you take the time it took Fitzgerald to crack through in the inquiry we had. Unlimited power, unlimited money, heaps, hundreds of millions of dollars that he could spend or whatever. And he went on day after day, week after week, month after month, and month after month. And then he only broke through when he said, I'll give indemnity to anyone who will spill the beans on somebody if there's somebody. And only then. How would I ever get to know?
Maybe you should have instituted an inquiry yourself.
The last thing about my experiences now today, the investigation people, they are the ones that ought to be investigated too, to be fair about it all.
But you're not saying that the findings of the Fitzgerald inquiry are inaccurate or wrong, though, are you?
Well, the whole line that they took, the idea was, and the word that I was given continually by the minister that was handling it then, that we were going to have a squealy clean state after he finished. We've had 100 times more corruption and rape and murder and violence and robbery and drugs than ever we had before Fitzgerald started.
You're not serious?
I am serious. The records show that. The Courier Mail have pointed that out. You take the mall that I always kept neat and tidy, no problem. People could go day and night. There's been about 20 people wounded, hurt. 2 people have been killed, half a dozen others.
But what we're talking, Fitzgerald was talking about corruption within the system, with the police and the bureaucracy and the connections between government and business.
Yeah.
That's a bit different from
no, well, see,
a bit of nonsense
if you want
in
to
the
know
wall.
in that one, everybody knows today that it's worse than ever it was. It has not improved anything. It doesn't do anything. And the CJC is like a slow dog chasing a hare. It's always behind the event. The event has always happened. What I say is, in my day, we had visual police out there that you could see.
Yeah, but all this other stuff was going on while you had visual police.
Yeah, but it does not the violence, and not the rape, and not the murder, not the drugs, and all these other things and robberies that are going on. That didn't exist in my day. Practically nil.
Well,
yes, it's
bit of
true.
an exaggeration.
Practically nil. Practically nil.
Well, even if you were right, that doesn't make the other kind of corruption permissible either, does
Now, you
it?
tell me, George, how you'd stop it if you didn't know it was there.
That's true, but maybe we would have thought the Premier had ways of finding out.
No, I'd have no ways of finding out. If the police commissioner who lives right in the centre of these fellas, and who wanted to find out, Whitrod, and who got Scotland Yard out here, twice, And he had everybody he could think of using to try and find out. If he couldn't find out, if he retired and left the state on the basis that he thought there might have been some, but couldn't find it, how would I know?
Under pressure from the media and his cabinet over Fitzgerald's revelations, at first, Joh refused to stand down. But ultimately, he had no choice.
Thank you for your support down the years. I do appreciate your prayers and your messages of love to me and to Flo. I wish you well. Thank you all. Goodbye, and God bless.
Premier,
all the best to you all. Thank you very much.
Premier, how do you feel towards Mr. Mahern?
I want to say to you all, thank you for your attendance this afternoon. I wish you well. Happy Christmas.
He was 8.5 months short of serving 20 years as Premier.
Was it you or somebody else that described Quentin as a dirty little grub?
No. That was Russ. Russ had a, I don't know, Quentin rubbed him up the wrong way too, and I suppose it's because I can always, still to this day, hear Russ coming up the corridor and say, "Where's that dirty little grub, Quentin Dempster?" Poor Quentin, anyway, he always took it in good part, I think.
Was he one of the chooks? Was Quentin one of the chooks?
Well, Quentin was one of the chooks, but he became one of the chooks that got so vicious that I wasn't even going to feed him anymore, and I sort of brushed him aside a little bit the last few times.
Do you feel, at the very least, sad and upset that after all those years, 40 years of public service, that you went out the way you did? A, being forced out of office, that's the only way I can put it.
Sure, that's right.
And B, then having to face the ignominy of the Fitzgerald inquiry, being cross-questioned, then finding yourself dragged into court.
Into
and
jail.
all that went with that, into jail indeed. Joh Bjelke-Petersen, of all people, in those sort of circumstances.
I've never taken anything for myself when they asked me how much kickback do you get and this and that and all the rest of it. I said, I never take kickbacks, and you insult me by asking me, I said to Fitzgerald. These are the things that sort of made me disappointed, in the sense that a lot of people would say, where there's smoke, there's fire, and Joe's done things he shouldn't have done when he's making out he was straight down the line.
Do you think you might not make it through it? The pressure must have been enormous. Do you think you might?
Oh, it was enormous. But initially, I was sad about that point, because then a lot of decent people honest people and who depended on me, I felt. Then in the end, I said, well, why don't you call me a homo and everything else? I couldn't care less. I said, you can call me anything you like.
That was all that was left.
I'm so hardened to it all, because I know it's not true in my own heart. I know I didn't take that $1 million bribes as the greatest load of lies you can see, that the court and the jury found was fact.
Just move back as he comes out, please. All right.
After waiting 5 agonising days for the jury, Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen emerged from the court late last night with plenty to say. But his victory was tainted. The jury could not reach a verdict. Some were for him, some against him.
I am innocent, and these people in here couldn't prove otherwise. Didn't I tell you I was innocent? I can't prove it.
Only hours before the jury was discharged, the Crown tried to have the whole trial aborted. It was revealed that the jury foreman was an active member of the National Party and had connections with the Friends of Joh Association. Luke Shaw, a branch secretary of the Young Nationals, was described by the Crown as an admirer and supporter of the former Premier.
You came out of your court cases extremely bitter. Am I right?
You're dead right. You're dead right, George, and with justification. You know, when just starting at the beginning, you know, down the 20 years, there's a system that goes by that every judge, every QC, has got to go over every one of those fellas that became a judge or a QC in my time, had to come to me to get their approval and to get their rating. So all these people that got stuck into me in every way that they could. To me, the whole thing was without justification. And the CJC, George, let me tell you this. I appreciate the opportunity. They don't tell you why they shove a corruption charge on you like they did on me as soon as I got out of politics, and they subpoenaed me, ultimately, and then they put a corruption charge on me. With no justification. Nobody had complained about me that I was aware. I never heard of it. Nobody said to me, Joe, we've charged you, we blame you for this or blame you for that or anything. Without any justification at all, without any reason, because they never tell you. They don't have to tell you, and they don't tell you. They went ahead and cost me enormous sums of money, enormous sums of money. All other states, where there is justification, they pay all their fees and all their costs and everything. But to me, who did a great thing for Queensland. 41 years, I left $1.5 million behind in superannuation because they said I didn't go out into politics to make money. But anyway, that's beside the point. But the point I want to say in relation to this whole system, this whole legal system, George, it has wrecked me and shaken me to my very foundations that it operates the way it does. These fellas that I put in there thought that they qualified and all the rest for their positions. Boy, does it want cleaning up, and the jury system. How can you have ex-union people on a jury?
Or National Party executive.
Well, what, one National Party against out of 12, 11 others, something, whatever they might be, or 10, whatever it is. What a hope have you got? I always said you haven't got a hope in the world in this whole system. My word, it needs cleaning up. When they can do to me what they did to me and get away with it, as I said, they've got the judgment to come that they've got to face all those characters. But on the other hand, George, I know that's not for me to make judgments or decisions in that regard. But down here in Tasmania, we've got an interesting thing. This would make a perfect, an independent quality, tax-free. We've talked to that. We had a conference this morning with people on it here. And
leading the Tasmanian secessionist movement.
Well, I could lead it at least in the direction of putting it together without any problem. I've been on TV, radio here doing it.
Seriously?
Yes,
Tasmania a separate...
No. Yeah, absolutely. It's a perfect island. It's got everything you do. It exports 4 times more than it imports. It only gets half the revenue that Canberra gets, the $1 billion plus the Canberra takes out of here.
The Bahamas of the South.
Well, it would be more than that, far better than the Bahamas. It's got everything for tourists, for investment, and on a 25% tax, not tax or charge, nothing else.
If you weren't against the Republic, you could be the first president of Tasmania.
Well, it's not an impossibility, but on the other hand, you wait and see. If there's an opportunity, the thing of going down that way, no more dull.
The Joh paradise that you failed to create in Queensland.
Tasmania, if they followed the procedure that we've suggested, that I've suggested, 1 or 2 others, it would become the envy of all the state because all the investment would come here.
Well, we'll watch.
Tax-free.
We'll watch with great interest. So, Joh, thank you very much for your time. It's been terrific renewing the acquaintance.
Oh, thank you, George. Same to you. Very nice. Thank you.